it's such a beautiful country, really, even though Melbourne sits on it. I'd like to start off telling you a little bit about my family background and my course through the work that I've done. I'm retired, but I'm not retired. But I started my life off in fact, I've lived at Labertush all my life. I don't know whether any of you have read the Jackson's Track book. It was my father's memoirs. My father was a white man, married, lived with a black person because Mum never bothered to get a divorce after she left her first husband, who was a violent man. So we grew up on Jackson's Track in a bush setting, and Dad was a sawmill, or owned the land and had a sawmill, and so part of that in the early 40s, 50s, meant that my grandfather, who was a full-blood Aboriginal person, was on Lake Tyers, and through the ministry, or the Board of Protection Days, they were put on there for their own protection because they were a dying breed. And so if I stop there, and I'll come back to it because it's so to get to understand what all of that means that for somebody like my grandfather, who married a woman from up at Horsham, and the tribe up there is called Watchabollock, and they're around the Grampians area. But she was a widow, and came down when they closed the mission down at Horsham. The mission up there was called Ebenezer. The mission at Lake Tyers was just Lake Tyers Mission, and then there was a second mission which was in Gippsland, which was called Rumyak. And Rumyak was the Movarian, is that how you pronounce it? The Movarian? Something like that. They were the German, it was a German, he was a German minister. And the Germans were out here working with a lot of that rural area, and particularly from their faith-based areas. And so he thought that by working with the Aboriginal people, that he would be able to convert them to their faith and Christianity. And so there were lots of them. And my grandmother was a very religious person. Listened to Billy Graham, if you go back to those days. The wireless at night time was the only bit that you heard from the outside world, and so 6 o'clock daily, Billy Graham would come on, and my grandmother would sit and listen to his services. And then for us, that carried over into us having to go to the end of our road to meet some Christian people who gave us religious instructions at the end of the road. And then as you progressed into primary and high school, you got the other side of it as well. But my grandfather, who was the full blood, had a terrible start to his life in ways where colonisation, or I'll go back one step, his grandmother was a full blood, fully initiated woman with all of the scars across her chest. And her partner, or husband, if you call it that in culture, they had been together for quite some time, and how they stayed together as a unit, I don't know, to tell you the truth, because colonisation started when they were bringing the cattle into Gippsland, and the only way that you could get into Gippsland was by the sea or down through the Aboriginal trails across the mountain range. And those tracks have been there for 65,000 years. And so part of those tracks down off the mountains were their trade tracks, and there were areas where that the stone flint, which they call the green axe, is predominant up in around Omeo and the high country. So that's sort of along that passageway towards Kosciuszko. And when you found those, after, you know, even now, if you find those green axes, at least you can identify where they've come from. So that came out of there. So my great-grandparents were those people, and when my grandfather married his partner, my grandmother, after she came down, she wanted to speak her language, and he said, no, not on my country. So again, the structure of Aboriginal society and life was already in place, and so whilst they never took their wives from, they removed them enough so that it was the right thing to do genetically, and for the longevity of keeping tribes together without any of the problems that you have if you have inbred situations. So he was very strong and staunch about his Kurnai connections, and so she wasn't able to speak her language, and so and she didn't have a say on country, because part of the structure, and if you know that Aboriginal structure is all about the family connections, extended uncles and aunts and so on, so that part of that exposure is about being able to leave or go with other family, but you're my aunt, so you're allowed to absolutely make sure that I do the right thing, and if I need to have a clip over the ears, you can give it to me.
Yep.
And there's no...
I'll keep that in mind.
there's no coming away from that. So your uncles and aunts were your mothers, your extended mothers, so they kept you in check the whole time. And so you already knew that that was the right structure that you were going to be placed in. So across the mission area itself, there were a number of already connected people, and so it was just like one great mob with many uncles and aunts and many cousins and second cousins and so on. So it was quite a good place to be brought up in a way. And so when it got to the stage where his mum had died, my grandfather's mother had died, and his father, he was sent off to, and I'll go back a bit more, so in those days it was the Board of Protection, so that's where it starts. And so the Board of Protections and the church decided that they were the right people, and then you had other the Scottish people and Irish, and then Indian and Afghanistan and you know Dutch, the whole lot, were coming through and trading along the shores of Aboriginal people's land. Wasn't a problem because some Aboriginal women were taken. That was part of what had occurred. Some of them ended up speaking 5 languages, so they spoke Spanish and Dutch and Portuguese and all this sort of stuff. So, and if you look at the islands between Tasmania and the mainland, Victoria, then you can see that they were all grouped with Aboriginal people as well. And so I suppose if you go back a step as well, that land mass that was there started to break up and those islands became part of it. But Norman, I'll just diverse a bit more, but because this is the important part of it as well. But Norman Tyndale, who was an anthropologist from South Australia, decided that he would travel Australia and collect the hair of all of the full-blood Aboriginal men, which happened to be in 1939, and my grandfather was still on Lake Tyers. So his hair was taken, and we've just been through a project where before the Ice Age, when we were all connected across the world, and then Ice Age occurred, and then waters rose and did all those sorts of things, Aboriginal people came in from across the world, but no one really knows whether we came out of Africa or where we came from. We assume we did, somewhere along the lines. But then I heard a very interesting thing yesterday when I was listening to the radio talking about Sumatra and the last major eruption from a volcano there, and apparently there are these massive caves over there. And so they were trying to find who were the last inhabitants and what happened to them. And then they say that all happened, and then there was that mass exodus across the whole of the globe. So it seems to be that in this project that they've taken the DNA from, we came in from the top end of Australia through the islands and came in and then followed the ocean around and then sort of came back into the central part, not quite into the desert country, but came in and then eventually got up to the desert part. And I found that really fascinating, and the idea of that project really is to see where people start and then to see how they broaden out and where those genetic lines end up linking. And so there'll be a dot, there'll be a map of Australia with all of these crisscrossing, because you'll find that people that were on the east coast ended up on the west coast and down the bottom. So that's still to play out, but it's a fabulous project to be a part of, because in your DNA they'll be able to tell you whether you lived in desert country or whether you were coastal people or whether you were mountain people. So again, I think that scenario is fantastic. So that occurred with my grandfather, and so he got quite sick of, after going to, when his parents died, he was sent to a reformatory school, which was out here at Bayswater. Well, Bayswater would be over there somewhere.
So it's the same.
Yeah.
That way, actually.
And so, and part of that reformatory school was to teach boys and girls how to actually do work, and if you go back to those days, it would have been open farmland, and there would have been a cottage where they all stayed, and so they had cows and this sort of stuff, and so they would have to look after the animals and do the work. And then he came back home to Gippsland, and I think he would have been down there, and the reason I know all of this is not because he's actually said this to us, but in my research of him, I found all of this evidence in ANZARD of the government. So we're the most recorded lot of people known to man.
Yeah.
You couldn't breathe without being recorded. So after seeing that, and he was the only one that went there. So I don't quite know what happened to the other three, four boys, 5 of them, 4. So again, it sort of makes you wonder what happened to them. Did they stay at the mission and somebody looked after them, or what was the story? So that was all right. And then in the 40s and 50s, he'd had a gutful of it. He'd been shot at by the mission manager because you either took the rations that they gave you which was the start of, but, okay, I'll go back a bit more. And so part of what they did for their entire life were hunters and gatherers. And so the men did the big game, women did all of the small gathering of root systems and ferns and a whole range of things. And so, and the structure of that meant that the girls learned how to do basketry, they learned what foods to eat, what foods they couldn't eat. The boys then had the same thing where the little boys stayed with the women and they had to have the digging sticks, and as they got into having initiations to manhood, then they became the hunters, which is no different to what happened probably in your own cultures. So ours was just more primitive probably because we didn't have the guns or anything like that. So I think that those sorts of areas were predominantly bedding down the skills of people and how you live together as to support one another, so that if I had to go and collect the wood, well then half a dozen kids came with me. And that, so he came off the mission and then came down to where my father had a property and found work down there. But all the way down he'd been working, and for what he got paid he would then take it back to my grandmother because it propped up and gave them some more of the commodities, so that the protein was in the part of it, and that the green groceries were there, apart from the flour and the tea and the sugar, which is the rations that they got, so they could get the other stuff. So then he came down and got work with my father, and then he finally brought my father's people down. But, you know, in all of that time, that sort of the trauma of that in itself, of losing your parents and then being shot at and then being told you can't do this and being told you can't do that. You were almost in prison. So in 1860, the mission was built there. Then you had, in 1886, you had the Half Caste Act, which is mixed blood people, so white and black. And then they decided that the mixed blood people, the half caste, should be sent away to work out in the broader society and to get work, because the government couldn't afford to keep them. And so the more that they were out and about, the more women got pregnant, the more the actual half caste system grew, and so it overtook the full blood system. And my grandfather in 65 or something like that, where Lake Tyre's land was handed back, he marched, because even now in this day and age, Framlingham, which is down in the Western District towards Warrnambool, and Lake Tyre's, the land is a system where it's called the Lands Act, and these two missions sit on that. And so it becomes difficult for the government to know what to do sometimes, and so they always threaten to take that land off, even though Lake Tyres would have probably nearly 300 people on the mission at the moment in houses, and a lot of them live there, but a lot of them work in and throughout Bensdale as well. So, but it's also got its own medical centre and that sort of stuff, and so people work there. It's got its own kinder, so people work there. And I think to some degree, you know, what the government does is it gives in with one hand and then takes away with another. And so some of the actual Land Act, my grandfather fought for that and marched in the streets of towards Parliament House around and trying to keep the land there and for the people to stay there. And I think it was Rowan Dellicum. Yeah, was that it? Yeah. He was the Governor General at the time, and so he handed back the land. And you know, my grandfather's statement, because he's recorded as part of that as saying it's good for the coloured people. So again, it wasn't about what they could do themselves as full blades, because they were still being harnessed by the government and controlled by it. Every time that you went off the mission, you had to have a card that you carried with you to say that you had permission to literally go out to town. And then, because part of those mission days were around controlling people, they took the kids away. They took them off the families and they sent them to back to where some of the families came from. So some of them went back to Lake Conda, some went back to Framlingham, and then to Horsham, Ebenezer, Corrandu, which was out at Healesville. And then you have, and I'll give you a list of this sort of stuff because it's just fascinating to read. The women, once they stopped speaking their own languages and learned English, then they learned to read and write. Most of the people that were doing the reading and writing now weren't full blades; they were half castes. And for some of those some of those full blades that learnt to read and write, they did a fabulous job. And when you read how they write to the powers that be, the Border Protection Board, requesting that they try and get their children back, and it's that's that old English style, and it just absolutely blows your mind when you start reading how they're wanting to have their kids back. And that depended on the managers of the station. If the managers didn't like you as a person, well, you had Buckley's hope, really, of getting your kids back. So again, it was a form of just taking them. So that went on for quite some time, and still went on right up until it's sort of like the 50s before all of that stopped being. And I suppose the reality around it was that we were lucky that we were at Latitude and we had our grandfather, but there was a whole range of black fellas, because that's how we describe ourselves in Victoria. And now we describe ourselves as, because we're allowed to say that who we are, because before that you couldn't say who you were, at all. You didn't have a voice. So now you could identify as strongly as you could like to be of who you are and what your lineage is in terms of your tribe. But going back to those days, there was probably something like 100 people on the father's property, and he paid them for whatever they could cut in terms of wood. Because if you go back to those days, the early 1900s, they had steam power. So all of the factories and that were run by steam engines or steam motors of some description. So they had to have, and so part of the work that he did and the Aboriginal people did was to cut down lots and lots, and there was, they used to strip the wattle trees for tanning and that sort of stuff. And so, which has got really some really good medical benefits to it as well. So there was, white people didn't know that, but black people do. And so, anyway, the whole lot used to work in the bush, and they out in the rural areas, you'll find that where they had the pastoral runs, which were the cattle properties, you'll find that on parts of what was Crown land was these tram track lines that ran all over the place to get to the railway line. And so a lot of the work that they did wasn't just for the factories out there, they were for the factories that were here in Melbourne. So it wasn't a hell of a lot of money, but it was money enough for people to be able to lived better than on a mission and had something in their life, and they loved it. And so, as a kid growing up in that environment, we had such fun in terms that there was a big mob of us kids, and we would go for hours during the day up the creek, and we'd be, spend time chasing possums through the trees and just being out there playing in the water, or just being out in the bush, really just doing nothing per se. We found it brilliant. But we had our chores as well, we had, you couldn't leave the ground until, the water was brought up, the wood was all collected, and so there was a structure in the camp for us that was, that held us to making sure that any of the earth around the place, because there was no floors in the huts, they were just bare floors, bare ground. So again, it was about how you kept your place really spotless and clean. And given that you're in the bush with snakes and all that sort of stuff, close to the water, summertime, they'd be there. So you had to do all this sort of stuff. But Aboriginal culture itself was very structured. It had the two parents and then the extended families. And I think that, part of that structure then led on to areas where that respect, first of all, was connection to land and to your country, and you were given responsibility. An example of this stuff is that my grandfather, who was removed from his country at Warrnambool, came into Gippsland and married into the Kurnai, but his totem was a whip snake. So again, people had their totems, and our totems for our tribe are the emu wren and the superb wren, and they were the sexual projections of who the tribe were. And then you had other areas about the birds, so you might get a skin totem and that sort of stuff. So everybody had this, and part of that was to actually say that you cannot kill that species. So there was laws around what you could do, what you couldn't do, because that was part of looking after the country, looking after Mother Earth, who then gave you back your life. It was about the food that you would source things from and that you wouldn't want to have them killed. As kids, one day we killed a porcupine. Well, we got the biggest thrashing going because you're not supposed to do that. So again, you learn by your mistakes, and as kids do, this is what you sort of, you test the waters in some ways, and so, and then as time went on, we killed some goannas, but we ate them because we were allowed to eat them. So you learned by what you could do and what you couldn't do. But I think the structure of Aboriginal society was one that was very, very tightly sprung. We talk about our own spirituality and the connectedness to country, but and what that physically means is looking after Mother Nature and making sure that she is able to give back to you, and that you don't do anything untowards, anything that's going to disrupt that passage. So we look at that, and then if you go from that spirituality, and then you go to custom and law. And what is custom and law? So custom and law for us is the structure of the law of abeyance, so that you cannot do certain things. And so again, that was part of the structure of keeping people understanding that this is law and they can't do these things. And so, and that meant that when it came to young men and women, there was no fraternising with each other in any way, shape or form, in case it, went over the top. So there was none of that. Women weren't allowed to speak to men. And so again, it was about how that behaviour of society was contained. So if you look at our society now, and I dare to say it, how horribly wrong it's gone. I mean, the broad society, not, you know, it happens here. But when you see people out of wedlock having kids and all this sort of stuff, and I don't condone that per se, but I say, well, at what point are these people going to know how are they connected to that human being over there? So again, all of this matters in the stream of things as people grow up and behave.
Can I just reflect
Yes.
on that? Because I'm just kind of, there's a couple of things I suppose that I'm
Interested in.
I just, these parallel things. So you have the colonisers' law,
Yep.
and you have your Aboriginal law and customs. And what I'm hearing you saying is all of this your Aboriginal customs and law define who you are, your identity, your place, how you relate with the land, what you eat, what you don't eat, and all of that kind of stuff. It defines the peoples.
Yep.
It gives you, it's your identity. And yet here you've got this colonisers' law that has progressively, well, from the beginning of invasion, fractured and cut and chopped up identity with its law.
That's right.
So that's kind of one law establishes who you are, and the other one fractures it and rips it
Well, it
to
takes it
shreds.
away.
Yeah.
Takes it away completely.
And so, then you've kind of come to the present day of this, I suppose, kind of almost like a tangled web that we're all living in now, which is kind of having a go at all of our identities, really, because the law says one thing, or the government's trying to control our lives in various ways. You've got to do this and got to do that. Some of the things are beneficial, but there's a lot of things that are really
That's right.
hacking away, if you like, abusing people's identity. But what you've described is historical abuse and trauma, and it's still going on with all the policies and laws that are happening. Is that?
That's it.
I'm kind of just seeing these.
But I think-
one gives you identity,
Yeah.
one takes it.
But I think the important thing to remember is that with the fracture of the actual Aboriginal society's law, customs and laws, and absolute looking at how you live independently as you grow as well, but how you keep and give back to your families and to your extended families. So when food had to be got, it was shared about with everybody. When the old got whole, some of them were left behind, but most of the time it was that people shared the responsibility of carrying and nurturing and doing that sort of stuff. When colonisation occurred, it was just taken away. Our language was taken completely, and we're just starting to get back into that now. Reclamation of language has been really, really a nice thing to hear about and to actually, and so we've gone through, and again, everything is written about us. So you can go back through those people that have written about the language and so on, and you can actually, we always say that, for example, John Bulmer, who was the minister at Lake Tyers, who lived with the people, and Alfred Howard, who was the police commissioner and then became the anthropologist, they heard people speaking every day. And so when they tried to record the language, at least you knew that they were with people every day and that they could actually record it correctly. So again, and this stuff of going back, looking at your language or looking at your culture, makes you reflect on the difficulties that occur for people, because at one stage you were free to do whatever you like, well, not whatever you like, but you were free to come and go on country and to be a part of a society that was well and truly looking after the food chain. And part of that too was around, for example, you know, when I talk about the green axe scenario, there were times when other tribes came together for ceremonial purposes, and part of that was about a trading performance, so that those people who didn't have the green axe could come and trade whatever they had that was going to be useful. So again, there was that sort of stuff. But just getting some of the things that happened around that too was around the fact that, you know, you heard the story about Burke and Wills, and if they'd taken an Aboriginal guy, they wouldn't have died. And that's true because when they came into country, they then hired Aboriginal people as police to actually come through, because remember that they didn't quite get all of the full bloods onto the missions. And so one of the things that my grandmother used to say to me when we'd come home from anywhere, make sure you look in the chimney, you know, and the chimney was only just an outline of a tin on the outside and a fireplace in the middle of a hut, because some of the wild blacks who hadn't been rounded up were still out there and were still very, in fact they'd kill you quick smart, because they had been isolated and so on. And these are some of the stories that, you know, they used to talk about, and certainly from a kid's point of view, they put the fear of God into you straight away, so you'd be always on the watch for things like that.
What was the chimney like?
Oh, they were just tin.
No, so why did you have to watch the chimney?
Oh, the black fella was standing in there.
Oh, okay.
Right.
Oh,
Are they the intruders or what?
Well, they were intruders into the house, and they weren't a part of the people that lived there. If it was, you know, they weren't a part of the family or the families, and so because they were never herded up and never, they never spoke English, and were still hunting like a tribal man. So these were some
So
of the
they
issues.
weren't compliant.
No, they weren't compliant.
There's something kind of alluring almost about the sense that there were people who were all along the way resisting this colonial imposition.
Oh.
Cheryl, you spoke about the way first contact happened via ocean, so people coming in from the ocean and down through the mountains with cattle. And just in saying that, there's a whole lot implied there about the use of land and the acquisition of land and the exclusion and so on. I know that there are stories that I'm not really familiar with about incredible violence that took place between colonial peoples and Kurnai people in those times, and I think the name of Macmillan comes into that story. I wonder if you could share perhaps just briefly some of that, because that first contact and the violence that took place often in that, there's a lot of deep-seated trauma, I imagine, present still because of those.
I think across Gippsland, there were two areas. Sort of the Western District was part of the first influx, and there was lots of massacres down there, and then Gippsland was the second lot. And it was around the Highland Brigade, you know, it was the Irish and the Scottish people who, they themselves had been, you know, invaded by England and all of that sort of stuff. So, and, you know, and the stuff
Was
that
it
went...
in Gippsland?
Oh, it was shocking.
But the Irish and Scottish brigades, I didn't know that.
Yes, yeah. Mostly the Scottish brigades, because most of the people that came into Gippsland with Angus Macmillan were other McLaughlins and McDonalds and, you know... All the mix. Yeah. But I think the other side of that, and it to me, it tells the story of how they didn't have any insight into the fact that it was sheer greed, that if you'd taken up, and this is how it goes, you take up what was good hunting ground with the right animals on it and plenty of them, and then you bring cattle in who then, and Gippsland across, if you've ever been into Gippsland, so if you go from probably Warrigal not so much Warriewood, but going in towards around Sale, in the heart of Gippsland country, were massive open plains of grassland and fed by enormous rivers that ran into what was the Gippsland Lakes. And the Gippsland Lakes were a freshwater lake, and so the abundance of water birds and the abundance of fish in there was just phenomenal. And so those clans coming up from sort of Wilson's Prom all the way up were able to sort of come and have ceremonies, and there was enough of those, the abundance of food to be able to feed everybody. But when the pastoralists came in and the land selection took place and they were paying the government for their pastoral runs and those sorts of things, it made it difficult for the tribes to survive. So in order for them to get their daily meat rations, so they'd start, killing cows and sheep, and of course that was predominantly the money for the pastoralists, so they didn't like that. So then they decided they'd actually start shooting and poisoning and doing all sorts of things, but they killed. They just didn't kill the men, they killed the women and the children and so on. There's about probably 3 sites that are really, really bad, and so when you go there, quite often it will be dead silence. You can't hear a bird, you can't hear anything, and that's because of the spirituality of what occurred at that place. That colonisation thing, there was also the white woman. There's a story about the white woman, and they believe that the Aborigines, the Kurnai tribe, had taken this white woman and held her captive. So part of the disguise was to actually go out and just shoot the Aboriginal people in order to find this woman, and it was never a woman at all. So again, all of these massacres occurred, and that left, and I look at that myself and I think, how did my family evade the white people? What did they know? And I start thinking about this sort of stuff. So and over the years, as my maternal grandmother was going about business, she used to sell a lot of her basketry, the baskets she made. She'd sell them to the white people who were coming out of Melbourne. We were a bit like going to the zoo, so they'd come out and have a look at what a blackfella looked like, and
Still happens today, though.
not as much, but it was there, and so. But she was very smart. She used to sell the baskets, but when people wanted to take photos of her, she wouldn't allow that unless she got paid for it. So again, she learned very quickly. She learned very quickly that the dollar, she could go and buy the groceries that she needed, and then be safe back on the mission. But these were the things that were. But that trauma that we talk about is really, really the storyline all across Australia. And until it's acknowledged that this was the frontier wars that went on. And one of the good things that happened for us at Drayton was that the commemorative park, which is where you raise the flags for Anzac Day and that sort of stuff, and so on, they commissioned that, and they included the frontier war in that for us, which was just absolutely fabulous. So they've got the 3 flagpoles, and they've got 3 of the Australian people who fought in all of the wars across there. But at the backdrop of that is our totems and shields to say that we're included in that. So whenever we do when we get to Anzac and those sorts of things, we're always involved in that, and that's just fabulous, just fabulous.
that anywhere else
No, not
that
that I
you
know
know
of.
of? I
No.
haven't heard
No,
of
there's,
it.
as far as I'm aware, there's very strong resistance to any kind of acknowledgement that
Mm.
frontier wars even occurred in most
Yeah.
Australian historical
So what
accounts.
happened in
Yeah.
Druin to get
Well,
it acknowledged?
I think in Broome, because we worked so well with, you know, with the Shire and sort of had been there for so long, and the other side of it is that, you know, historically you've got Lionel Rose, the boxer, who comes out of Jackson's track. You know, we played a lot of sport throughout the district, that sort of stuff, so you were well known, but I think we were able to actually work with people who got it, who could see that, you know, that needs to be there as part of the healing process, so
Yes.
that goes on. But I think a lot of that stuff, when you're talking about that, people don't want to talk about it. And whether white people don't want to actually acknowledge that it happened, I don't know. But for Aboriginal people, it's never that far away from you.
Couldn't be.
When the youngest granddaughter, she was in grade 6 and school captain at a little place, Longmurray, stood up at Australia Day and sort of said to the 200 strong there that she doesn't celebrate Australia Day, but I'm here today to celebrate my father's side. So again, part of, she would have been probably 11.
That's pretty gutsy.
I thought it was bloody gutsy.
Oh my goodness.
It's terrible, you know.
Yeah.
But I think having the conversation,
Yes.
that is the best part about it, because it happened. You can't change what's happened, but what you can do is you can learn from that, and you can have acceptance, and you can have healing. And healing is the second part now, where being able to go back to country, to be able to be in the bush, to be able to look at your surrounds, to be able to hear those noises, resonates those motions within you that you thought you'd lost.
It's healing for the land in that too, isn't it?
Well, it is. And I think, but more importantly, when you go back and you're allowed to do that, I think the best thing about it is that, and it gives that spirituality back to you. Because some places men's business, some places are women's business, but the biggest business is Wilson's Promontory, and Wilson's Promontory has got the most significant healing aspects about it because of its spirituality. You know, there's a mythical story around Wilson's Promontory, and when we go down there to do any business, like it's heaven, and if you go down with a cold, you come out without a cold.
Yeah.
So, or if you know, got something wrong with your muscles or anything like that, you come out healed. So, you know, and a lot of people go down there just for that alone. So again, it's being able to do the ritual things that we, you know, have done over a period of time. But that war front was something that has left lots of families disillusioned with society, and in fact they disengaged because of what has occurred through government policy, through, you know, just colonisation itself, and that trauma will be ongoing until we as elders decide that we have to heal. Can't keep going through life with that. And part of the detriment of people's souls and their identities and those sorts of things, you've got to actually be able to say to them, you've got to learn to let go of what had occurred and go back and start to heal yourself. We started to go and do bush medicine because we'd been taught what to eat and not what to eat and all that sort of stuff. So we started collecting some of the traditional wattles and that sort of stuff, and it's been just a fabulous journey. Look, we spend all of our life, for the 3 hours we go there, laughing. Absolutely, you know, there isn't anything that it, even though it doesn't look funny, but that's what comes out of sharing and talking and, you know, doing things. And I think that's the sort of stuff that's missing for all of us.
Yeah, it's got to do with joy, doesn't it?
Yes, and it's got to do with how society is separated us,
Yeah.
and how society expects us to do a lot of things that they can control.
Mm.
So when we go back and do this fun stuff,
Yep.
as I say, it is just fabulous. We send away the component of the oil to Southern Health University for analysis of the contents of the oils, and there's a peppermint bush that grows, peppermint, that grows in South Gippsland, and it's a round leaf one, where there's other peppermint bushes or spearmint bushes or whatever grow in other parts of Gippsland that don't have the round leaf. This one has the round leaf, and it is just divine, and it's for infections on the chest and for sinuses and that sort of stuff, and it's just absolutely beautiful. Just as, so we're going to make sniffers. You know how you got the big sniffers? We're going to make sniffers out of them. So, you know, that's the sort of stuff that you can do. So the healing has to occur to some degree. So I think that, you know, that the trauma is embedded in people's health really badly. And it's the way that their parents and their grandparents have handed that down in that colonisation process. And now it's really interesting when you talk about this stuff, because that trauma that occurs is showing up now as evidence in how they're talking about. And if you talk about anxiety, and if you talk about all the other illnesses that go with it, and you talk about depression and all of that sort of stuff, sometimes, and I don't separate, I don't necessarily mean that society, I think society now has all of this trauma that they don't realise that they've got because of what happens in everyday life, of, you know, the expectations of the society in general. And we've come from a society where, and I was just on my way down here today listening to when the walk clubs, the women's walking clubs were formed way back in the 1800s, because they were doing it with like-minded people, and they found that women's work and it was an outlet to be able to talk about, and people came from a variety of different backgrounds, and they talked about how people had gone to school and got their degrees, etc., but still had this camaraderie. And then the war happened and so on, and then people lost their husbands, and then the men had their walk clubs, a bit like the MCG, I suppose, where, you know, you couldn't get in there, you know, you'd never be voted in.
Yeah.
So again, and I was listening to that side of it, and when you go back to early colonisation, you can see the impact that has had on that society. If you start from that society and then you work your way through, where are we at today in society? And I say to people, what sort of a society are we breeding? You know, and that goes back to a society. This is how I see it. I see a society of where their expectations are that they are allowed to have, that there is nothing to give back, that they're not expected to give back. Well, in our society, obligations occur, and so you can't just take, you have to be your obligation is that if you take that, you have to give back here. Whereas in this society, white society, is that you take, or you work, but you're not obligated to actually give back anything if you don't choose to. And that then becomes an imbalance because there's so many more people giving and more people taking, so that there's not an even keel to it. So for me, when I look at that sort of stuff, I think, well, where are we? What sort of society are we bleeding?
Cheryl, I might, it's probably time to give you a rest, but I think that's a great question to launch us into our next session. Where are we now? So why don't we stop and have 15 minutes of a cup of tea, go to the loo, have a rest,
in the sun.
and stand in the sun in the beautiful garden. And then when we come back, we'll pick up right where you've taken us there and ask that question: what are the implications of all that you've shared with us for who we are as a society today? Particularly in terms of how can we perceive the presence of trauma passed through the generations, and how do we perceive ourselves in that context? I was just watching John Howard this week. I went back to an old YouTube video of John Howard giving his reasons why it was not a good idea to apologise to the stolen generations. And his number one reason was, well, this generation should not be expected to take responsibility for the sins of a previous generation. And it showed to me a complete lack of understanding of intergenerational connection. And the fact that all of us live in a society that has grown out of our story, the story of the intersection of two cultures, in a very violent way. So I think it's the question for us, isn't it? So why don't we have a quick rest, come back and launch into that conversation.
And instead of me talking, we might just open it up and have...
Give you a rest.
Well, I think it's good to have everybody's...
Absolutely.
And hear everybody's voice. So I think this will be the next stage. But I've given you some good background into
absolutely.
what has happened, but I think we need
My
to...
head's very full.
That's all right, you're at university. It's
Yes. In a good way. My head's
That's
very
right.
full.
Oh dear. Yes.
Do you want a cuppa?
Oh, I'd love a cuppa.
Yeah.
Yes.
Everything's
Milk, no
down in the-
sugar.
Milk, no sugar.